Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Warren. We got a great show for you guys because the Penguins, well, don't look now. They're actually winning hockey games. They had a great week over the Thanksgiving holiday. We're going to discuss their feel-good run during the holiday week, and if it's something that they can sustain as the calendar flips to December. And then part of that turnaround was Philip Tomasino. What are the early returns for Philip Tomasino, and why is this something that could be a diamond in the rough for the Pittsburgh Penguins going forward? Not to mention, he might just be the first of many. Another young player has been kind of headlined as to who Kyle Dubas is looking into in the trade market. He is not done as of yet, looking for a specific archetype of player. We'll talk about that and more on this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Let's kick it off with the Penguins just absolutely turning the page on what everybody expected of them over the past week. You said it a couple weeks ago to me. You said, I have tickets to that Thanksgiving Eve game, but I haven't really been enjoying Penguins hockey. And I think a lot of people would agree with that sentiment. And yet you go to that game, they turn on the Jets, and they haven't looked back since. Horwat, what has your take been on this 3-game winning streak, the first of its kind for this year's Penguins?
My overall take has been, I don't buy into the wins. This team is still extremely, extremely flawed and still is struggling to stay in the hunt and has its direction pretty much set in ways that we'll discuss in a few. But seeing them win against Vancouver, I sat back. I mean, they went up 5-1, I think it was.
Yeah.
And then they started giving up goals. The cynic in me just started thinking, do it. Give it up. Do the thing. Let's stay with narratives that are being put together and written and talked about with this team. Stay with the narratives, because for the sake of news and for the sake of just hilarity, that it would be incredible. I mean, then they held off and they managed to pull out a win, and then managed to pull out 2 more since. It's been an impressive little run considering the teams that they played against. It's the Canucks are no slouch. I mean, they might not be performing as good as they did last year, but they are still no slouch. Then they topped off the Boston Bruins, who are just spiraling, but also in a playoff spot. They're
above 500.
They're the most confusing team in the league right now, next to the Rangers. And then they beat the Flames, who, right? The Flames? Am I getting that correct?
Yeah. 6-2 win over the Flames on Saturday.
Yeah, and then they beat the Flames, who have been much, much better this season, unexpectedly, but need real help and might be kind of in I don't want to say similar situation as the Penguins, but also just aren't expected to perform at a super high level. But it's still the teams that the Penguins just beat here to put up 3 straight wins is impressive. It's, again, I still don't want to totally buy into this team might be able to do something, but if this was the groundwork being laid for something impressive, well, then screw it. Good times are being had all around.
Yeah, it's hard to be negative about a 3-game win streak, first and foremost, because that hasn't happened this season, let alone a 3-game win streak against 3 teams who are currently sitting above 500. Before this stretch, they had only had 1 win of that kind this season, and that was the 4-2 victory over the Washington Capitals. So not only do they get 3 wins in a row for the first time, but they beat 3 teams that all have a winning record, not to mention on Black Friday, you go into Boston. I understand that's an up and down team, but the Penguins have struggled mightily against the Boston Bruins at TD Garden throughout Sidney Crosby's career. So getting that 2-1 win was massive for them, especially because of kind of the way they were able to get that one. 2-1, right? We've seen, hey, every time and again, Sidney Crosby can light the lamp on several occasions, and the Penguins can just outscore their problems. That's what they've done in their few wins this season. But a 2-1 victory over Boston, where Tristan Jarry plays pretty well, over 1 goal above saved above expected. And then on Saturday, even though they won 6-2, Alex Nedeljkovic had himself a very good game with several 10-bell saves. So you're getting these contributions that you didn't get and that were actually problems leading into this stretch, because we talked last Tuesday and last Thursday when we had Kelsey Surmats on about right now this team just seems to have nothing going for them. Their special teams wasn't succeeding. Their goaltending wasn't good. Their defense wasn't good. Their secondary scoring had dried up entirely through the month of November. All of that because of, one reason or another, the magic of Thanksgiving Eve at PPG Paints Arena has all turned back the clock over the last 3 games. Like I mentioned, Jarry and Ned good. Special teams has been huge for the Penguins. I mean, 3 power play goals on Saturday, all coming from the second unit. The power play is clicking at 36% over these last 3 games, and the penalty kill, 100%, 7 for 7. So all that combines for a 3-game win streak. And you look at the Penguins, and I understand we can't get too far over our skis, like you mentioned, trying to bring everybody back to a dose of reality. They're still in a hole. They dug themselves into a massive hole at the beginning of the season, but it's nice to have a week where it looks like, hey, they aren't as good as they once were, but hey, they're as good once and for one whole week as they ever have been. So a lot of good things happening for the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Yeah, don't buy in too much. Don't drink too much of the Kool-Aid. They are still an 8th in the division.
Moving forward, it's a nice base.
Yeah.
Because they haven't had a base for 2 months in this season. They built that base last week. Can they build off of it as the calendar flips to December? That's what we're going to be looking for. And if they do, if we're talking about another holiday week where the vibes have been good between Thanksgiving and Christmas, then you can maybe start to change the narrative around this team a little bit.
And that's just when things will get interesting, whenever the trade speculation around multiple players really picks up, or around the league really picks up. And I mean, looking in history, teams have been in last in their division at New Year's, at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, all the things, and gone on to great things before. Penguins being one of them. The vibes just around this team, at least leading into the Thanksgiving Eve and Black Friday game, just weren't great, and the vibes weren't as positive as some of those teams that would go on to do great things have been. But for what it's worth, like you said, let's take these small victories, and not small, you know what I mean? Let's take these little wins, let's build on them, and maybe stack a couple, maybe just have some good cheer in the month of December, and just sort of, see what this team can do, appreciate the final years of this is really the time when it's going to come down to just appreciating the final years of Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, especially if they're not winning. I mean, the Utah game was a perfect example of that. You're going to appreciate the greatness of Sidney Crosby, 600 career goals. That's awesome. It was the only goal that the Penguins scored that game in a 6-1 loss. It mutes the celebration a bit, but it's at least a highlight of watching these 2 perform, watching these 3 perform in their final years. And also, I mean, Sidney Crosby has been slow the last couple of, weeks, not this past weekend. This past week.
Yeah, and you mentioned it there. A lot of what is going to keep Penguins fans interested is watching the latter portions of Crosby, of Malkin, of Letang as they wind down their careers, but specifically enjoy these winning stretches, because it's not like these guys aren't performing. Crosby and Raquel have been a crazy connection since that line was reunited. So you're seeing it in these winning spurts. This is when you can really start to enjoy it. But I do have a couple of people that I could give a quick shout out to, but there's one in particular that I need to highlight and headline here before we move over to talk a little bit about Phil Tomasino. Shout out to Blake Lizotte. We had talked a couple of times over the offseason about, they added Blake Lizotte. That's the sneaky signing that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy. His beginning of his Penguins tenure was muted and slowed down due to concussions, but since he's come back, 3 games played, 3 points, 2 goals, 1 assist, and he's played really good as that third line center. We all had questions of who's going to fill Lars Eller's role after he was traded to the Washington Capitals. Well, Blake Lizotte looks like he is 100% capable of being in that position. 54.5% of the expected goals for at 5-on-5, and outscoring opponents 3-1 in his 3 games since returning. And that is with 70% of his shift starts starting in the neutral or defensive zone. He only starts in the offensive zone 30% of the time, and yet he's able to perform well and still get out and get the advantage for the Pittsburgh Penguins over these last 3 games, whether it's been O'Connor or Bunting on the left side. That third line has looked much better, and Anthony Beauvillier as well, finding a home on that third line. And I think that's something that the Penguins will really, really benefit from if they're able to have that on a continued basis, because Beauvillier has been in the bottom 6 when he's been deployed there this year. Very good at times when he's been deployed with Crosby. If you can get him to play well in that bottom 6 away from Crosby, that's all signs pointing upwards. And I think a big part of that is Blake Lizotte. So I think he deserved some flowers here before his 4th game back from injury tonight for the Penguins.
Of course, he's been a solid piece that, like we discussed, could be a sleeper addition for this Penguins team, especially if they were to look like a better lineup, look like a better roster. He's going to be a huge piece of it. And so far, he's just been showing it. And every time he's have been in the lineup, he's been a useful piece.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even in his first game, he scores that empty net goal to get the Penguins the victory over the Montreal Canadiens. So shout out to Blake Lizotte, and excited to see what his position in this lineup is moving forward, because he was one of few players that actually got a multi-year contract from Kyle Dubas. So it'll be interesting to see how his role on the team continues to expand as he plays more and more games. Let's move over to talk a little bit about Philip Tomasino, because, I mean, shoot, Pens are undefeated with Philip Tomasino in the lineup. A fresh start has yielded great results for the young forward. 1 assist in 11 games played this season with the Nashville Predators. He comes over to Pittsburgh, has 2 goals in 3 games played, both of those goals ending up being the game winners on Friday and Saturday, respectively. Horwat, first and foremost, I just love the opportunity that they have given Philip Tomasino since coming over. We mentioned that when the trade went down, this is a guy that was eating healthy scratches pretty frequently for the Nashville Predators. He comes over to the Penguins and immediately gets placed on the second line alongside Evgeni Malkin, playing second line minutes. In his first game, he had 18 minutes of ice time against the Vancouver Canucks, and that is 7 minutes over his season average with Nashville through those 11 games played. So I really enjoy the fact that not only did they bring him over to give him a lineup spot, to give him consistent playing time in the lineup, but give him significant playing time on that second line alongside of Evgeni Malkin, something we really haven't seen them do with young players, particularly young players that are new to the system and new to the team.
Yeah, it was a little surprising, I thought, at least, to see him get an immediate push like that. But I mean, he's come in and he's earned the right to stay where he is. It's a little surprising considering what he had been doing beforehand. And the Penguins essentially taking in another reclamation project. Screw it. If it's working, it's working. It's the way we kind of discussed Anthony Beauvillier going into the year. We wouldn't be shocked if he started on a line of Sidney Crosby. We don't want to see it, but we wouldn't be surprised. Next thing you know, he's not playing great, but you know what he's doing? Scoring goals and finishing. Not many others were. Not only is Anthony Beauvillier still scoring, he's earning his role in the lineup. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Philip Tomasino is coming in, again, he had no goals on the year coming in. Now he has 2 and 3. Suddenly, you can't take him out until he starts giving you a reason to take him out. So it's a bit of a mishmash of these guys really shouldn't be in this lineup, but they're performing. Yeah. And you can't ask for much more than that.
Yeah, you're kind of getting a lot of dogs who have been underfed for a while. Anthony Beauvillier traded a couple times mid-season last year. He's really looking to revitalize his career. 27 years old. Philip Tomasino only 23 years old. He was a first rounder for Nashville, and all of a sudden he just couldn't find a role on that team. With under Barry Trotz's management, he just was pushed to the back, pushed to the side, and the Penguins give him an opportunity. That's, as we'll talk about later in the show, that's what Kyle Dubas is going to bank on, because we had an argument last week about, if they have the cap space, what star players are going to want to sign in Pittsburgh. I still firmly believe that it's not that attractive of a destination for star players who want to win cups and want to make a lot of money, but that opens the door for this type of player that wants more opportunity, that when given that opportunity can shine. We've seen it again. Very small sample size. Let me make that perfectly clear. Only a 3-game sample size for Philip Tomasino, but I've really liked what I've seen with him alongside Evgeni Malkin. I've liked what I've seen from him on the power play too. And shoot, the Penguins historically are not a team that has a lot of youth over the last 5 years, and not a team that celebrates all that much over the last 5 years. When Tomasino scores a goal, he looks like he's scoring an NHL goal, right? He does the fist bump. He skates away with a lot of purpose. I love the sellies from Philip Tomasino as well. It's not just a fist pump, and I understand Sidney Crosby's the understated fist pump, the let's go, but I like Tomasino really amping the energy up. I like what I've seen from him. And I think that early returns are very good on this trade, similar to what they were with a Cody Glass. The only difference is Tomasino's finishing, and you're hoping Glass, when he gets back in the lineup, can start to do that. But the play leading up to that is good as well, and I think that's a great sign for the Pens.
It is a great sign, especially if they keep on this track of those are the kind of players they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the Penguins are in such a weird situation because the expectations aren't high, and they've proven to not be reaching even the low expectations so far through the early parts of the season.
Yeah.
But suddenly with this idea of we're going to take in reclamation projects, we're going to see what player A, player B, and player C can do as castaways from their old teams. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, they're putting together wins, and it's, it doesn't necessarily, it's one of those weird situations where you look at it as, is winning a bad thing because maybe you could get a good piece for the future, but also if you win enough, suddenly you're going to be fighting for a playoff spot, and that's a good place to be in for the veteran core. Mm-hmm. That's what kind of puts this team in a limbo. But I think just at the moment, every win you can come across and every success story you can come across in terms of these castaways almost, that's net positive for the team. And it's not like these contracts are big and expensive, like certain players who are getting healthy scratch. So, but they're coming in and at least proving to be worthy of NHL roles, whether it's in Pittsburgh in the future or somewhere, but they're giving the Penguins success now. And that's part of the important job that Kyle Dubas has to do.
The question that I have about this, and we talked about it on Thursday on our Thanksgiving episode with Kelsey Surmatz of the Hockey News. She kind of talked a little bit about how Mike Sullivan wants to bring these younger players up in the Penguins organization and into the NHL lineup. He wants them to be, role players that start to build and become what Brian Rust is, for example. Rust came up as a fourth line winger. Now you look at him, he's a guy that's perennially around the 30 goal mark, even though he hasn't reached it yet, but he scores as a 30 goal scorer on those paces all the time. It worked back then. It hasn't worked of late. And we see players like Puustinen, who was not given much top six time despite being in the lineup a lot last year. Now this year, he's back in the minors. A guy like Vasily Ponomarev, who has a lot of offensive skill set, was given fourth line minutes in the 2 games that he played at the NHL level. And he was given fourth line mates in the 2 games that he played at the NHL level. The question is, why did they go away from it when acquiring Philip Tomasino? And why don't they do it more with guys like a Puustinen and a Ponomarev maybe later this year if we see a McGroarty or if we see a Tristan Bros get an opportunity? Is this going to be the impetus of Mike Sullivan kind of changing his ways when addressing these younger players coming into the lineup?
I'll tell you what, I don't know. Maybe it could be that they are now looking at their bottom 6 and going, this is solid. This is good now that it has returned to health in terms of Blake Lizotte, Kevin Hayes returning, Matt Nieto joining the lineup and refusing to be taken out. Not him refusing, but I mean Mike Sullivan refusing to take Matt Nieto out. Maybe because
I'm sure Nieto would have something to say if you told him that you were taking him out of the lineup as well. But yeah.
But I think because those sort of names were coming back to health, were returning, and needed their own and deserved their own chance at the lineup again, that it sort of pushed Tomasino up. Almost. It was kind of here's one guy who isn't performing, Michael Bunting. Bump him down while we put this new guy up in the lineup and just give him a push. Mm-hmm. I mean, I couldn't think of any other reason because it's not like you're going to get Philip Tomasino and then, like I said, you just had Lizotte and Kevin Hayes return from injury relatively recently, and Matt Nieto. You're not going to go to one of those 3 and say, hey, welcome back. You're scratched now because we have a new guy coming in. No, you're going to leave them in and maybe just give Tomasino just a more push than normal. It is confusing, and Cody Glass is coming back soonish, I believe. So really, that's just gonna make more lineup decisions difficult to make. Like I said, you can't take Beauvillier out of the lineup right now. He's finishing. You can't take Tomasino out. You just got him, and he's finishing. Maybe they gave Tomasino that bump because they knew Cody Glass was going to come back and make other lineup decisions difficult. Because at this point, you do have to take out if you want to put Cody Glass back in, you have to take out a Matt Nieto. Maybe take out a Noel Acciari for a healthy scratch for a game. Maybe do it to Kevin Hayes for a game. Maybe Blake Lazat. You can't take Tomasino and Beauvillier out right now. And maybe you could with Beauvillier because it's, he's really only scoring and not much else. But you need those goals, especially if you are all of a sudden, maybe we should go for it.
Yeah. I think part of it also has to do with the overall NHL experience. You look at Bonamara, under 10 games. You look at Valtteri Puustinen, that's the weird one. Because last year, he had a lot of NHL experience. This year, not really given an opportunity. So, and again, you look at a guy like Jesse Puljujärvi, and I understand he's not as young, right? He's not 23 years old like Philip Tomasino is, but he's eaten some healthy scratches despite being very good for stretches for the Penguins. So just some interesting deployment. I think it's worked out in Tomasino's favor that Sullivan has kind of made an exception for him, it seems like, in this instance. But to me, it just signals that maybe you should make that exception a little bit more often. And maybe he'll get the opportunity to. We'll talk about, another player here that the Penguins have been connected to that fits the same mold as a Cody Glass, fits the same mold as a Philip Tomasino. Multiple reports are indicating the Penguins now have interest in Nils Höglander of the Vancouver Canucks. It was reported by both Kevin Weeks of ESPN as well as Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet and 32 Thoughts, the podcast. Friedman had this to say when talking about the Penguins' potential interest in the young forward. Quote, he's going through it right now in Vancouver. He's struggling to get ice time. I think there are some teams that are very interested. I think Pittsburgh would be one of those teams, and Pittsburgh makes a lot of sense. You hear the fact that Kyle Dubas is not done looking for young players that, as you're mentioning, could be cast-offs from their former teams. What do you think of the potential of Nils Höglander, who is 23 years old and under control for the next 3 years at $3 million after this one?
I'll throw in Rick Dollywall from a Vancouver reporter and insider also says the Penguins are really in. So there's a lot of people saying that the Penguins are taking a heavy look at Nils Höglander, and it feels like a couple years in the making almost. I feel we've been discussing his name for ages.
Well, shout out to Jesse Marshall. He's been banging this drum for years.
Yeah. And it might finally happen, judging by, multiple reports of saying that they are one of the front runners. And it's more of the castaway, more of the, struggling to really make a difference with the team that he's on currently, but has the potential. He's still young. He's still under control. This could be it's just another good positive move forward. We're going to bring in the reclamation project because those are low risk moves in general. If they don't work out, well, as long as they don't cost a lot, I don't know Höglander's contract off the top of my head.
3 years left at $3 million. He signed an extension that doesn't kick in until next year.
Ooh, that's a little tough.
But he's 23 years old. I mean, the guy's 23 years old, and he scored 24 goals last year.
He did, yes. And there's hope that he can. There's a lot of hope from a lot of teams that he can get back to that this year. The Canucks, like we said, they're a good team. They might not be reaching expectations, but they're still a very good team. And maybe he's just kind of getting lost in the shuffle there of certain areas need to pick up, and his ice time is declining as well down there over there. So maybe for him, a change of scenery on a team that doesn't have high expectations. So someone's got to go out there and do the thing. Why not? I mean, the extension not kicking in until next year is very interesting, that all of a sudden he's, being put on a trade block like that. You don't see that very often. But it's the Vancouver Canucks. It's Jim Rutherford in that front office. And he's going to have his eyes on certain pieces that maybe he's familiar with from the Penguins organization. And it's also something that Rutherford, in terms of looking to make a deal, after signing an extension, but before it kicks in. Remember when the Penguins were in on JT Miller?
Yeah.
That deal hadn't started yet, and it was a $8 million deal. I mean, that was the Ron Hextall era. Those old discussions, and JT Miller ended up going on and being worth it for the first season of it with 103 points.
Yeah.
But this one is fascinating. $3 million kicking off next year for 3 seasons. I mean, he's under control, so that's a very attractive trade piece. I could see it totally, I don't want to say totally working out in the same way that Tomasino and Beauvillier have so far, but it's got the potential to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, 23 years old. We mentioned it. 36 points in 80 games played last season. He was a big part of that resurgent Vancouver Canucks team, including 24 goals. I mean, once you score 20 goals in a season at $3 million, that's a bargain. Now, do you get that, or do you get this version of Nils Höglander, who has 5 points, only 2 goals in 23 games played? Right? That's the risk, is you get him and he was a one season wonder and he never gets to that level again. But if it works out, and again, if this player isn't in the return, which I haven't heard, but we have heard that this name has been floated out there for high-end prospects in return before, I would love to pair Nils Höglander and Rutger McGroarty in the Penguins lineup. Maybe not on the same line. They both primarily play left wing, but having both of those guys in your lineup, I think gives you an identity moving forward that the Penguins haven't had in a while. Nils Höglander is not a massive human being. He is 5'9" and 185, but he plays bigger than he is. What have we always heard about Rutger McGroarty? He's built to play in the NHL, but he plays bigger than he is. I would love to see Höglander and McGroarty be two, not pillars. I don't think they can be pillars of an organization, but two smaller pillars that are part of this kind of shotgun rebuild that the Penguins are trying to pull off here. I think those two would mesh very well in a Penguins lineup and help give you a little bit more of a physical identity, which the Penguins haven't had in a while.
Yeah. First of all, Kyle Dubas, stop throwing Rutger McGroarty out into trade conversations.
It was only in the David Jiricek conversations.
And I would have blown the lid.
What do the Penguins need? What do the Penguins need? And here's why I understand it. I would rather them not make that trade. I would rather them not include a guy like Rutger McGroarty, but the Penguins have nobody at right defense, right? They have nobody at right defense.
Right.
Jack St. Ivany, decent third pairing defenseman, diamond in the rough find last year, has struggled at times this year, but they don't have any defensive prospects on the right side that jump off the page. David Jiricek jumps off the page. Now, I understand why you wouldn't want to pay all of that for David Jiricek at the moment in time, because one prospect doesn't fill up your entire cabinet, which is very bare. But I understand potentially floating that name out there saying, hey, it's the old paperclip adage. If I trade a paperclip, can I eventually get to a house? If I trade a Braden Yeager, can I eventually get to a David Jiricek? I mean, that's what Kyle Dubas was kind of in the end game with. But fortunately, it's not a conversation we have to have.
Correct.
Because he ended up going to Minnesota. The Penguins hold pat with Rutger McGroarty, and that is not a name that's going to go out there for just any prospect.
No,
David Jiricek was a prospect that, again, special circumstances require special conversations, and that's why McGroarty's name was involved. But I don't think you're going to see McGroarty's name involved in the Höglander trade. If anything, I think it might be part of speaking of things that are years to come, or have been years in the waiting, might be part of a potential Marcus Pettersson trade down the line. But I don't think it would be McGroarty that would be going the other way. But you never know. Again, you never know how these conversations end up.
Yeah. And circling back to the Höglander thing.
Yeah.
It's, he's not producing right now, but again, much in the way of how Tomasino wasn't getting any ice time. I mean, Nils Höglander hasn't really been getting any ice time either. All 5 of his points came in the first 10 games of the season. He's gotten none in his last 13. But the ice time has also just dipped and dipped and dipped. I mean, there's a 9-minute, 9:23 a couple weeks ago. There's some 10s. There's an 8, a 7, a 9, a 6.5.
Oh, geez. At that point, why are you dressed?
Exactly. 9 shifts, played 6.5 minutes against the Buffalo Sabres. Canucks did get a win, but, it's still. He played when the Canucks played the Penguins, he played 9:14.
Yeah.
And, he recently went back up to a 10.5 against the Red Wings, but was a -2. Took a penalty, and, the shots, he's also not shooting as much anymore. It looks like since those first 10 games, he's gotten not a ton of shots on goal compared to picking up 2 to 3 a game in the opening stint of the season. So maybe the confidence is gone. Maybe there's little bits and pieces of getting lost in the fold, like I mentioned. But if he was to be dealt to Pittsburgh, it's a new situation. It's a new city. Maybe they give him a different push in the lineup, especially depending on what is going the other way. Maybe a forward is involved there. Maybe that's where he can slot in. I think it could be useful to get this kid some extra juice, a little extra confidence, and give him a new opportunity, because clearly with the minutes that I read there, 6.5 is not...
You can't do anything in 6.5 minutes. You really can't. And if you do, then you're never going to have 6.5 minutes again, right?
Yeah.
You start producing anything in 6.5, you're going to start getting 8, 9, 10 immediately after that.
Especially as a player who has 244 NHL games under his belt.
Jesus.
It's not like he's a fresh find. It's not like he's a rookie getting his first cuts. No, he's been here. He played 80 games last year, scoring 24 goals. Played 60 a couple years before that, and scored 27 points in his first season. Was 8th in Calder voting. I get that's 8th. 8th in Calder voting is essentially you got a third place vote.
Yeah.
But in the shortened, no less, 2020-21 season, 56 games played, 27 points. So he proved it right away that he could do something. Last season he picked up 24 goals, and now it is, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
If the Penguins believe they can get something there, if they can fix them, go for it.
I think this all leads back to the fact that both of us love Kyle Dubas taking these swings on guys like Cody Glass, on guys like Philip Tomasino. And the more things work out, which I think that even though he didn't score a goal, I think that so far things have worked out with Cody Glass. So far things have worked out with Anthony Beauvillier. It's a little bit of a different story because he was an unrestricted free agent. So we'll take him out of this conversation. But Cody Glass, Tomasino's early returns, the more these work, the more he's going to target these players, because it's just telling him, hey, these fresh starts, if we pick the right players and we put them in the right situation, they are going to be great, low risk, potentially very high reward finds for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, it's a little bit more of a risk when you're taking on a guy who has 3 years remaining at $3 million versus taking on a Cody Glass who was on an expiring contract, taking on Philip Tomasino who's on an expiring contract that's under $1 million. This is a little bit more of a risk. But I think when you've succeeded in these other smaller risk scenarios, it gives you the confidence to go out there and take a big swing, or a bigger swing, I should say, on a guy like a Nils Höglander. He was in on David Jiricek, who we talked about. That's a huge swing for the Penguins, trying to bring in a talented, young, right shot defenseman. And he was also connected to Kirby Dach in a lot of those rumors as well, who, first and foremost, Kirby Dach is still 23 years old. Like, Nils Höglander is a player that, man, he's been in the league that long and he's still only 23. But Kirby Dach specifically, being 23 years old, is baffling to me.
He should be turning 24 soon, but still,
I believe he turns 24 on December 20th. So
January 21st. But
Höglander birthday is December 20th. So both of them are turning 24 in the next 60 days.
Yes, but Kirby Dach is a player that played 64 games in the COVID cutoff season, the 1920 season.
Yeah, and if you've been playing since before then, you're a grizzled veteran in this league, because it feels like that was a century ago.
Pretty much, yeah. And with Kirby Dach, I think the situation's a little different. He had injuries all of last season that held him to just 2 games. Had 2 assists in those 2 games. That's called a point per game pace, if you ask me. But then again, he's playing in Montreal, where they are building something special for the future. It just doesn't seem like he's going to be part of it because of a gazillion different players that are supposed to really take over that team. 8 points this year in 24 games, only 1 goal. I think I'm a little higher on Höglander than I am Dach.
That was going to be my next question. Of those two, would you prefer the Penguins go after Höglander, or would you prefer them go after Dach? Because it's essentially a similar situation, just a pick your poison of player. They have similar contracts and they're of similar age as well. So
yeah, I think I would roll more with Höglander. Not only because he's under control, I think a little bit longer.
Yeah, two
but
more
also,
years.
Yeah, but also has proven it more.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that Doc hasn't proven it. He's always been on a bad team. It's kind of that holds him back a bit. He was with Chicago at first for 3 seasons, where he played 64, then 18, then 70 games for 59 total points. It's not phenomenal, but it's also your first 3 years in the NHL, cut off by COVID, no less. But then in Montreal, where he had 38 points his first year in 22-23, but injuries since, it's tough. But I just think I would say what I'm getting at here is Hoglander's ceiling seems higher than it does for Kirby Dach. Just despite how much of a house of fire Kirby Dach kind of came in like. I vaguely remember him being talked about as possibly a very important piece for a team down the line.
Yeah, I mean, coming into the NHL out of the draft, Dach was a 3rd overall pick, and Hoglander was a 2nd round pick. But I think what you've seen is Hoglander show that ceiling is pretty equal, and he's been a lot healthier during his career than Kirby Dach has. And not to mention, I already talked about the physicality that Hoglander brings. Again, he's not going to go out there and be a Nola Chari. I don't think they make him like that anymore, but he's much more physical in my eyes than Kirby Dach is. So I would agree with you. I would go with Hoglander over Dach if given the option and given the opportunity to just pick 1 for 1. And a big part of that is that 2 more years of control, right? Kirby Dach has this year and next at 3.3. Hoglander would come in this year at 1.1, and then it goes up to $3 million for the following 3 years. So I think I would stick with Hoglander as well. The question that I have then is, do you have the opportunity for them? Because Tomasino's come in and things have worked out to where he gets the opportunity to play on the second line. And I think that's a big reason as to why he has succeeded in that short stint so early. Do you have the opportunity for these guys? Because you look at the left side right now for the Penguins, you have, whoever's on the top line right now. Rickard Rakell is on the top line, either him or Rust. You have Michael Bunting, you have Drew O'Connor. So do you have an opportunity for a guy like Nils Hoglander to come in and kind of get that more ice time, right? Get that role in which he can actually fill in like he did last season. I think that's going to be the biggest question. Does that mean there's players going the other way in any of these moves? I would have to think so, because right now, I mean, Beauvillier has had to bounce to the other side, but he's still been playing pretty well. It's hard to take him out of the lineup. Puljujarvi's been taken out of the lineup. Puustinen, who's been decent in his time when he's been in the lineup, has been sent down. So you have to have the opportunity for these young guys when you acquire them. That to me is going to be the other interesting factor into when or if they end up going out to getting one of these guys. Who do they supplant in the lineup? And again, part of that's going to be who's struggling at the time. But right now, there's a lot of guys that are starting to turn the corner a little bit. Does that continue? I don't know. But if it does, and you do get one of these guys, how does that balance out? How does Mike Sullivan end up shifting the roster to get these guys the opportunities that they need to turn the corner on their careers?
I know we've already discussed a bunch of players that could be dealt away. Mm-hmm. And Marcus Pettersson's the highlight piece there, but he doesn't fit in getting the guys we've been discussing opportunities.
Yeah. No. Then gives Owen Pickering an opportunity, which I like.
And he's already getting one with Pettersson in the lineup, so
yeah.
Wash.
But
when it comes down to it, maybe that's when you start looking at if Drew O'Connor really is on the block, if Rickard Rakell finds a new home somewhere, you're going to dig deep. Maybe Matt Nieto's time is running thin here. Maybe Nola Chari could be finding something too. Maybe even Michael Bunting. The Penguins were at one point in November very much looking at everyone except for Crosby and Malkin is up for sale. Yeah. That's the way it felt. Now, as a 3-game winning streak comes along, suddenly it's, we can keep Brian Rust around. We can keep Michael Bunting as 5-5 now for 10 points. Maybe we hold on to him a little bit longer.
Yeah.
It's people are extending their stays essentially. Kevin Hayes is still just getting here. So maybe you retain him a little bit longer. Anthony Beauvillier is still just getting here and scoring. He stays.
Mm-hmm.
Blake Lizotte is returning from injury. He stays. It's getting to that weird point. But as long as the mentality is still everyone except for those two is on the block,
mm-hmm.
then you start having the discussion of, Rakell, O'Connor, and Nieto are the top 3 that could open up forward spaces.
Yeah.
top 3, quote unquote. You know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
The most movable.
Yeah. I love that you're saying, yeah, maybe they're extending their stays, where immediately my brain goes to maybe they're rising their trade stock.
Yeah.
Maybe they're growing their trade stock. And again, you can't trade everybody. So some of these guys are extending their stays.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But some of these guys might be thinking, I'm extending my stay here. But instead, what's really happening is, oh no, you just became a conditional 7th, or you went from a conditional 7th to you're now a 5th worth a 5th round pick. So instead of extending your stay, you've shortened it considerably. So it's a matter of who ends up in which camp. I think there are 2 camps there whenever you have these players that are starting to perform better. Guys like Cody Glass, Beauvillier, you mentioned, Michael Bunting coming around since the slow start. It's up to Kyle Dubas, and Kyle Dubas, and I'm sure a few select members of the Penguins front office are the only ones aware of this. Who's going into which bucket? Who's going into, he's extending his stay. Maybe we keep him on a little bit longer, versus, okay, let's really start to hammer home that this guy is available because he's playing better and we can get something for him. So I think that is going to obviously be the biggest storyline for the Penguins as the season progresses, as who ends up in these conversations, who ends up being dealt out, who ends up being dealt in, because it feels like it's going to be a mixed bag for the Penguins for the remainder of the season. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.